I feel like Corrie is such an amazing example of true heartfelt forgiveness for people who did horrible things to her and to her family. And I think that's something that we all can take away from this, is that because of what Jesus has done and how he has forgiven us, then we now have the power to forgive other people.
Jennifer Kelley taught high school for 15 years. She and her husband Aaron serve in leadership roles at their church in Columbia, South Carolina, where they have one young son. She's also the author of The Story of Corrie ten Boom, the Watchmaker who forgave her enemies, which is part of Crossway's Lives of Faith and Grace series for kids. Jenny, thanks so much for joining me today on the Crossway podcast.
Well, thanks for having me.
So Corrie ten Boom's story it's a story full of adventure and sorrow and really remarkable faith on her part. Can you share a little bit of the first time that you encountered her story?
I remember hearing about Corrie ten Boom as a child. I grew up in church and going to Christian school and Christian camp, and I feel like I always heard missionary stories growing up and stories of great men and women of the faith. And I remember watching the Hiding Place movie. It might have been when we had a substitute at our Christian school. I don't remember what the circumstances, but I do remember watching the movie and then always hearing about her and stories. I think it was sometime in adulthood, my sister was talking about the book, and I thought, I need to read that again. That would be a great idea. So I was about 35. I was single and teaching. I had just been visiting my family in the Atlanta area, and I was driving back early one morning to South Carolina to get to school in time, 8 o'clock, to get to my class. And I wasn't paying any attention. And I was listening to the book at a very pivotal, sad time in the book. And I'm bawling my eyes out and not paying attention to the speed. And all of a sudden, I saw lights behind my car and I got pulled over at about 6:45 in the morning, and I'm already trying to suck up my tears as the policeman comes, and I got my first and, thank the Lord, only ticket in my life from going, I think I was going at least 25 over. I wasn't paying attention at all. And so I got my first speeding ticket listening to The Hiding Place. So it always has this little place in my heart of funny, but also a tender story in my life.
Did you try to explain to the officer why you were going so fast and why you were crying, or did it just all kind of blend together?
I didn't. I thought I would sound really silly. I'm listening to this book, and her sister is dying, and it's sad. And I decided not to worry about it.
Yeah.
I just apologized and thanked him. And
It is a powerful story about Christian faith motivated by Christian love. And there's a reason why it's persisted in evangelical culture, especially as this incredible testament to the gospel. So I wonder if you could just kind of take us back to the beginning of the story, set the stage for us. Who was Corrie? Where did she live? And what was going on around her?
so Corrie was born in 1892 in Amsterdam in the Netherlands. She was the fourth child in their family, and there was a sister, a brother, and another sister. And that's actually another reason I've loved Corrie, because I'm actually the fourth child. I have a brother and two sisters, so I always feel like, oh, me too. I'm the baby of my family of four. So they had a large family, and her dad, whose name was Casper, he was from a family of watchmakers in a small town outside of Amsterdam called Haarlem. And so when Corrie was young, their family moved back to Haarlem, back to the family watch shop, and moved in above the watch shop. And so her three older siblings, and then eventually three aunts. So the mom, and her name was Cornelia as well, and Corrie's named after her mom. They all moved in together. And so they lived above this watch shop in the small town of Haarlem. And when you think of Haarlem, think of cobblestone streets with the winding streets coming off of a central market with a huge cathedral. You've got canals that freeze over in the winter and huge windmills with the tulip fields out in the country, very, very Dutch. So she grew up as a little girl above the watch shop, and she and her siblings would jump rope in the streets outside the watch shop and ice skate on the canals in the winter, and had a great childhood. but their house was pretty small, above the watch shop, so they were having to make do, and then their dad decided to buy the house behind the watch shop, and they realized that the house both of them were hundreds years old, very ancient houses. They decided to enclose the space between the 2 houses and put them together. The bad part is the front part of the house where the shop was 3 floors. The house behind it was 4 floors, and they did not match. And so they actually enclosed the 2 between them and kind of had this odd shaped cobbled together house that they nicknamed called the Beje. It's spelled Beje, and it was named after the street that they lived on. And so this big family with aunts and children all living above the shop where their dad worked.
Hmm. What do we know about Corrie's upbringing in terms of her faith?
Her family was very religious, and each generation, it seems, had put their faith in Christ. And her parents were faithful attenders at the church, the large cathedral there in the center of their village. And when she was 5, she was playing with her doll, who she named Casparina, which was named after her dad, Casper. And as she was playing, she was knocking on the door and she was asking to come in. And that's when her mother had said, "Well, just like you're knocking on this imaginary door, Jesus is knocking on the door of your heart." And so that's when she accepted Christ as her savior. It sounds like their family was just full of church and going to teaching times and lessons as well as concerts. They had Bible time at their home every night. The parents wanted the children to learn to read in multiple languages and speak multiple languages, so they had Bibles in various languages, and they would study the scripture in English and German and Dutch, of course, and then even some of the ancient languages. One other thing about their family was that Corrie's grandfather, whose also name was Willem, her brother was Willem as well, he had started in the 1830s starting to pray for the Jewish people. He was struck with the idea that he needed to pray for the Jewish people in his community, and so he decided to every day to pray for his Jewish neighbors. And so that continued down from the grandfather, down to Corrie's father, down to Corrie. And so that was part of their daily time in the Bible and time of prayer, was praying for their Jewish neighbors.
It sounds like she grew up in a really solid, loving Christian home that cultivated this kind of faith that we would see play itself out later in her life. Why do you think it is so important for kids to be exposed to these stories of other Christians, maybe from throughout church history? What impact did that have on you, and might that have on other kids today?
I think people like Corrie are such an example of faith, which obviously is God's working in them even as a young person, which I think is an amazing thing to see, that God can work in the lives of little children and can use little children, that even little children can know God. As a little child, one of the things that she used to do was, as she played in the streets right behind, like a block away, there was a police station and there was prisoners that she could see behind the bars in the prison. And she started praying for them because she knew that they obviously had made some wrong choices and they might need Jesus. And so she started praying for them. And I think that even that simple faith of a child praying for people that she would never meet is an amazing example of children can know God. Children can have a prayer life. And even as these parents, faithful parents who may not have actually gone to seminary, but just faithful parents who owned a shop and they lived in the little spaces above and behind it, that they were faithful in teaching their children, and obviously the Lord doing the work in the kids, but the faithful prayers and the faithful day by day instructing and teaching and kind of hand holding of these children in their faith.
That can just be such a powerful thing in a kid's life, especially when you think about, to me, the fact that Corrie came from this pretty quote unquote insignificant family in a little tiny town, and then went through all these terrible things and probably didn't necessarily know where it was all going to go, and the impact that she would eventually have. Leads to one question I had. How was it that her story got told after her experiences?
Just at the new year of 1945, when she went home to Harlem, she started talking to people in church or just community about what had happened. And then eventually she wrote a book pretty much within the first year of being home. She wrote a book about her experiences in prison. And then she started traveling. She decided that she needed to go. She had felt God's call on her life to go and to leave home and to spread her story. And so she on faith went to America and started meeting people and was asked to speak in churches, and then from there met more people and met more people, and she eventually wrote over 25 books. So she has quite a large library of her life, whether it's stories about her childhood all the way up to her travels. And then at some point, she crossed paths with the Billy Graham Association, and that also brought some notoriety to her and speaking engagements. And then in the 1970s, her most famous book called The Hiding Place was written alongside Elisabeth and John Sherrill. And so that is where I think a lot of people found out about her. And then a few years later, they made the Hiding Place movie, and she had a hand in that as well. So I feel like that's kind of where she became famous because of some of those things.
Yeah, yeah. So take us back then to the dawn of World War II. Just briefly walk us through the key events that followed from that.
So by this point, her mother had passed away. Those three elderly aunts that lived with them had passed away. Two of her siblings had gotten married and moved away to have their own families. So all that was left in the Bay was their dad, and he was over 80 years old, and her sister Betsy and her. And so they were three of them living a normal life, working in the watch shop. And in May of 1940, the Nazi German army invaded. And back during World War I, Holland had been neutral. Germany did not invade, and so they were not in threat of war. Although I will say that back in World War I, the Ten Booms opened their house to the children of German watchmakers because Corrie's dad, Casper, was very connected in the watchmaking community. And so he invited all of these children who were in danger from the war to come and stay with them. So they opened their house to those children back in World War I. So back to World War II, they are thinking they might survive being neutral again, but the Nazi German army invaded, and the Dutch army fought for about 4 or 5 days and then ended up surrendering. And so things got very difficult quickly. Restrictions, curfews, not allowed to be outside your house after 10 o'clock and then 9 o'clock. And then that just kind of progressed. And everyone had to surrender their radios so that you couldn't hear what was going on outside. But the Ten Booms actually had two radios. And so they submitted one. Corrie walked theirs down to the department store to drop it off, but then they actually kept one and they hid it in a compartment in that spiraling staircase that was between those two parts of their house. There was a hidden compartment. And so they hid it. And so then at night, they would listen to radio broadcasts. Maybe someone would play the piano really loudly in the sitting room. And so then they would listen to the radio and get reports from England and kind of find out what was going on.
And that was just the very beginning of what seems to be a pattern of some quiet resistance that the Ten Boom family started doing. So what are some of the other things that they did over the course of the war that maybe they didn't want their Nazi occupiers knowing about?
Yes, they were very brave. And I think it was probably a hard decision for them because they had been faithful Christians and obeying. And then here comes this invading army. Do they defy them or not? But a couple of things happened. One of the things that happened was the very difficult and strict regulations enforced on the Jewish community. So they would walk around town and they would see signs going up that say Jews will not be served. And so obviously Jewish people were not allowed to go to those theaters or restaurants. And they noticed that some of their Jewish neighbors were disappearing or their shops were being ransacked. And then the Jewish people had to wear these yellow stars that said Jude on them, and just very oppressive things happening at that time. So one day, Corrie was in the watch shop, and a group of Gestapo men come down the street, and they start ransacking one of the neighbors' Jewish-owned shop. So Corrie and Betsy run out into the street, and they grab their neighbor, and they bring them inside up into the dining room, and while his shop is getting ransacked. And so he stays with them that day, and they're trying to figure out what to do. So Corrie goes to a neighboring town where her brother Willem lives, and he's a pastor, and he's also been helping Jewish people. And so Corrie goes and asks Willem, "What can we do?" And so Willem says, "All right, tell Mr. Veal is his name. Tell him to be ready tonight, and tell him to be ready to go." And so Corrie goes home, tells him to be ready to go. And that night after curfew, Corrie's 20 or so year old nephew shows up at the door and takes the man away. And so they just disappear. They go off into the street and Corrie doesn't see them again. So later she sees her nephew and says, "Hey, what happened to Mr. Veal?" And he says, "Aunt Corrie, if you're going to work for the resistance, you can't ask those types of questions." And she thought, "Oh, am I working for the resistance now?" And so
Wow.
that was kind of the beginning of it. And there was after that, families started showing up at the door, knocking at the side door of the Bay asking for help. And they always basically said, if someone knocks on the door, we will let them in. And so they started making connections with people and trying to secret people out to the countryside. And what the problem was at that time, everyone had to use ration cards. So if you each citizen had to get a ration card, basically like coupons. And if you didn't have a coupon for milk, you couldn't buy milk. And if you didn't have a coupon for bologna and cheese, you couldn't have bologna and cheese. So the problem with feeding people staying at their house was they didn't have enough food, and the Jewish people were not issued ration cards. So Corrie was trying to figure out what to do. So she took the train back out to her brother's town and said, "Willem, what do I do? I need to feed these people at the house. There's 3 people staying with us right now. I don't know what to do." And Willem said, "I can't help you. You're gonna have to steal them." And she said, "Steal them? You're a pastor. What?" So he said, "You gotta figure it out. I can't help. I don't have connections. I can't help you." So Corey's thinking about it on the way home on the train trip. And so she remembered a man who had been their meter man, which is, I know, an old phrase, but the person that would come around and see how much electricity you had used. And so she went to go see him because that man was now working in the food office for the Nazi regime. And she wasn't sure if she could trust him, but she thought it's worth a try. And she prayed, "God, if Fred is not trustworthy, please stop me before I ask him." And so she knocked on Fred's door and said, "I am having people staying at the house and they're Jewish." And she was kind of waiting, and he didn't react. And she said, "I need ration cards." And he said, "I can't give you ration cards because every single ration card has to be accounted for." And she said, "There's nothing can be done." And he said, "Well, maybe if we stage a robbery." And so he concocts this idea of staging a robbery, and Corey said, "Stop, don't tell me anything more. I don't want to know." And so he asked
Wow.
her, "How many do you need?" She needed 5. And instead of saying 5, she said, "I need 100." And so
Oh, my word.
he stages a robbery, he has a friend beat him up, and then a few days later at the side door at the Bay, Corey answers the door, and it's Fred, and he is all beaten up. He's got black and blue eyes and holds out a packet, and inside are the 100 ration cards that Corey can then use and distribute to Jewish people.
That's incredible. It's just so dramatic and so amazing to kind of see the work and the strategizing and the secret attempts to protect these Jews who are eventually living with them in their house. But at some point, eventually, Corrie is arrested and she's sent to a concentration camp. How did that actually happen? How did they find out that the Ten Booms were not who the Nazis thought they were?
So Corey knew that any day, anytime, they could be arrested. They did have safeguards in place with code words and things like that, but they knew that at any time they could be arrested. The police station where she used to pray as a child for the prisoners was just around the corner, so they knew that they could be in danger anytime. So one day in February of 1944, Corrie was sick, and so she actually was in bed, and Betsy came and said, "There's a man in the watch shop who wants to talk to you, specifically you." And so she got dressed, went downstairs to the watch shop, and she said she just felt like something was off, but she herself was sick, so she didn't really think too much of it. And a guy was asking about money because his wife had been taken, and Corey didn't even think to use code words, and so, she said, "Come back later, we'll have the money for you." And so he left, and she went back to bed because she was ill, And the house was actually very full that day. There was not just the family, but her older sister and older brother were there with their families because they were having a Bible study, and there was resistance workers, and then also the people hiding at the house. It was a very full house that day, and she was sick. And then later that day, um, the Gestapo comes to the door and busts in, and everything just becomes chaotic. And dozens of people were arrested that day, but not
Wow.
everybody.
Yeah. Wow. And so then she goes to this concentration camp, and that's a huge part of the book and of her story is just the suffering that she experiences there, and she's moved around a little bit, and she meets a guard there who becomes a pretty important character later in her story, even years later. Tell us a little bit about what happens there and when she comes face to face with this guard again.
She initially went to a Dutch prison. She was there for a few months and in solitary confinement. Then she and Betsy were moved to a Dutch concentration camp. And then eventually they were taken in very terrible circumstances to a all-woman concentration camp in Germany, north of Berlin. It was very harsh, just very terrible circumstances. And there was many women and men guards there. And one of the men was especially cruel, especially when the women first arrived. They had been squished into boxcars to be transported on their journey, and they were weak and sick, and they had to give up all of their belongings. They had to strip down and take showers, and some of the guards were mocking them and very, very cruel. So then, after she is released and she is actually back in Germany teaching at a church,
And this is
she
after the war, right?
after the war, she actually had said, "God, I will go anywhere you tell me to go except Germany." Like, she did not ever wanna go back there, and then, of course, the Lord said, "Hey, I would like you to go to Germany." So, she goes back to Germany and is teaching in a church, and people are devastated. After the war, their country is just torn to pieces, and there's devastation and homelessness, and they need the gospel. And so she goes back to Germany. Even though it was hard for her to go back to Germany, she does go, and she spends a lot of her ministry there, actually. So a tall man in the back of the room starts moving toward the stage, whereas everyone else is moving toward the back door. And she sees this man and she realizes, I know him. And in her mind, instead of just seeing street clothes, she sees a military uniform and a skull and crossbones on the hat. And she's taken back in her mind to this horrible guard who is laughing and cruel and just a terrible person. And he comes to her and says, "You mentioned in your talk that you had been at Ravensbrück. I was a guard at Ravensbrück, and since then, I have become a Christian, and now that I'm a Christian, I would love to ask your forgiveness for the way I treated the prisoners there." And Corrie just felt such hatred in her heart. He had been so cruel that she just did not wanna forgive him. And so she said she stood there for it felt like ages, but it really was just a few seconds, and he extended his hand and said, "Will you forgive me?" And she didn't wanna forgive him, even though the talk she had just given in this church was about God's forgiveness, and she did not want to forgive. But then she said, "God," in her heart, she prayed, "If you want me to forgive, please help me to forgive this man. Help me to be able to raise my hand and forgive him and shake his hand." And she did, and she said that, God gave her the power to forgive, and that was pretty much her theme through most of her teaching time after the war was, first of all, she preached Jesus, that Jesus is the victor. She preached all about the gospel of Jesus, and then secondly, she also preached forgiveness. Those were her 2 biggest themes of her time post-war.
Yeah, this book is written for kids aged like 8 to 13, this kind of middle grade age. And as you talk about some of the really terrible things that Corrie experienced, how did you approach telling Corrie's story in a way that was true to what happened, but also age appropriate?
It is definitely difficult to think about explaining a concentration camp to a child. I definitely wanted to be sensitive and careful and tended to use more general language and softer language to explain things that at some point in their older lives they can learn more. Like, they marched away and they never came back, or there was unnameable fears or things like that, just more general, but also still communicating that bad things happened.
Yeah, yeah. And I think you did a really good job with that in the book as I was reading through it. It's a tricky thing to navigate, though. In the book, you include so many just vivid historical details and cultural details, locational details, life in Holland, the Dutch underground, even some Dutch words occasionally. What did your research for the book look like?
Corrie ten Boom wrote so many books on her own, and she also wrote articles and journals, so I read a lot of the books she wrote, as well as journal articles, and I have to say I loved it. It was such a pleasure to read her work. She is such a delightful person, just an absolutely incredible writer and delightful person. So I read many of her books and then also did other research on Holland and things about World War II. I love history, so it was actually fun to read about bicycles during World War II and how the bicycle culture in Holland I also enjoyed adding the details about the tulips because that is such a part of the Netherlands, and it does play a part in World War II as well, because as the people are starving, they actually end up eating their tulip bulbs because they didn't have potatoes or other food. So it was interesting to read the historical details that was specifically centered on Holland, on the Netherlands, especially during World War II.
And I think some of those details are ironically things that stick with us as modern readers, certainly as kids. We can kind of latch onto the details, and they really help us to see that, these stories from history are true stories. These are real people who lived and had lives just like all of us. And sometimes when you just look at the big events, you lose a little bit of that earthiness to the stories. Maybe now, as a final question, Jenny, as you think about the young readers who are going to come to this book and read it as it's published, maybe even your own son as he gets older and reads this book, what do you hope that they take from the story of Corrie's life?
I think some of the takeaways for me, which I would also hope would be for the young readers and for their parents, would be some of Corey's famous quotations, which would be never be afraid to trust an unknown future to a known God. I feel like that truth is so resonant, whether you are facing a soccer tryout, a spelling test, or you are thinking about your job or what's happening next week with certain meetings, that unknown future that we can trust to our known God. When it comes to forgiveness, I feel like Corey is such an amazing example of true heartfelt forgiveness for people who did horrible things to her and to her family, and yet she willingly, gladly forgave them through God's power. And I feel like we are often easy to hold grudges against people for the slightest things and not have that heart of forgiveness. And I feel like she's an amazing example. And I think that's something that we all can take away from this, is that because of what Jesus has done and how he has forgiven us, then we now have the power to forgive other people.
Well, Jenny, thanks so much for walking us through the incredible life and story of Corrie ten Boom and for writing this book that will hopefully introduce our kids and the kids that we love and know to this amazing story of faith and forgiveness. We appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
That was Jennifer Kelley on the life of Corrie ten Boom. For more, check out her book for kids, The Story of Corrie ten Boom, The Watchmaker Who Forgave Her Enemies, which is part of Crossway's Lives of Faith and Grace series for middle grade children. Pick up a print copy of the book for 30% off, or get the audiobook for 50% off directly from Crossway by visiting crossway.org/plus. And if you like this interview, check out another conversation I had with Lucy S.R. Austen entitled The Life and Legacy of Elisabeth Elliot. To listen, click the link in the show notes or search for the episode wherever you get your podcasts. For more audio content like this, subscribe to the Crossway Podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast player. If you enjoyed this episode, consider sharing it with a friend and leaving us a review. Crossway is a not-for-profit Christian ministry that exists solely for the purpose of proclaiming the truth of God's Word through publishing gospel-centered content. Visit us today at crossway.org.